Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. It's Nick Holmes and this is episode 112 called Greek Fire. In the last episode we heard about the fall of Egypt in AD 642. The first Arab Caliphate now ruled an empire stretching from Iran to Egypt and from Syria to Yemen. It had created the largest empire in the shortest amount of time in all of human history. The Sasanian Persian Empire was on the brink of extinction, and to any contemporary observer it must have seemed as if Rome was about to go the same way. But the remarkable thing was that a large chunk of the Roman Empire survived. Called Byzantium by most historians, this was not what I regard as a continuation of the Roman Empire that had lasted for over 600 years from the days of Augustus to those of Heraclius, but rather a successor state, a predominantly Greek-speaking and Greek-populated medieval empire that shared many of the same institutions and territories with those of the later Roman Empire, but which was also fundamentally different. We call it somewhat clumsily the Byzantine Empire. But before we consider in more detail its strikingly unique and interesting features, I want to look at its first great test, its desperate fight for survival that lasted from the departure of the Roman troops from Egypt to the first Arab assaults on Constantinople itself. So let's begin our journey with the death of Heraclius in January 641. As I mentioned in the last episode, it was the Senate which stepped in to resolve the bitter dispute between his successors. Martina, Heraclius' second wife, was accused of poisoning his eldest son, Constantine III, by his first marriage, and her tongue was cut out and her own son was disfigured by splitting his nose so that he couldn't become emperor. In their place, the Senate placed the crown on Constantine III's son, the 11-year-old Constans II. Fortunately for the young Constans, in the first few years of his reign, the new Arab Caliphate focused on destroying the Sasanian Empire, and so there was a lull in the fight against Rome. After the Arabs' great victory at Qadisiyah in 638, the Shah Yazdegerd III had fled into Iran and reappeared with a new army in 642, marching to retake the Persian capital Ctesiphon. But he was defeated at the Battle of Nahavand, which marked the last major battle between the Sasanians and Arabs. Yazdegerd fled to the eastern corner of the Persian Empire, hoping to raise support against the Arabs, even sending envoys to China. But it was to no avail. He was finally betrayed and murdered in 651, bringing the history of the Sasanian Empire to a formal close. Arab preoccupation with Persia bought the Byzantines some breathing space. With Constans still a boy, the Senate and a general named Valentinus were the empire's de facto rulers. However, they fell out and Valentinus was murdered in 644 or 645. Fortunately for the Romans, Constans matured into an intelligent and decisive emperor, and the first event of his reign was an attempt to reconquer Egypt in 645, although given his still young age, his involvement must have been limited, and the expedition was no doubt masterminded by the Senate. So in the spring of 646, a Byzantine fleet sailed for Alexandria, hoping to exploit a dispute between the Caliph Uthman and the conqueror of Egypt, Amrah, who he'd recently recalled. Initially, it met with some success. Alexandria was reoccupied without difficulty. Byzantine units advanced south, hoping to retake Babylon, but Uthman quickly reinstated Amrah, who met the Byzantines near Nikiu and defeated them. The Byzantine army retreated to Alexandria and sailed away. Never again would Byzantine troops return to Egypt. However, The battle for Egypt opened up a new phase of the Byzantine-Arab conflict. This was a battle for control of the Mediterranean. The ease with which the Byzantines had sent a fleet to Alexandria made the Caliph Uthman nervous about possible naval attacks on the Syrian coastline. His answer was to instruct his governor of Syria, Muawiyah, to build the first Islamic fleet. In 649, this was ready to set sail with 1,700 ships, and its destination was the island of Cyprus, which Muawiyah occupied and sacked. He repeated this in 650, and in 651 he overran the island of Aradus off the North Syrian coast, which was a fortified naval base. By now, Byzantium was firmly on the defensive, and from 651 to 653 there was a truce between it and the Caliphate, and although we have almost no information about the terms, I think it's highly likely the Byzantines paid tribute. With Sasanian Persia utterly destroyed, Uthman planned the destruction of Byzantium. He knew the key to this was to capture Constantinople, and at some point he decided to use his newly formed fleet to spearhead a combined naval and land assault on the Byzantine capital. In 654, Uthman cancelled the truce and instructed his trusted lieutenant Muawiyah to begin his great attack. The first target on Muawiyah's way to the Bosphorus was the island of Rhodes, where, according to the chronicler Theophanes the Confessor, the famous Colossus of Rhodes, in fact a giant statue of the sun god Helios, was still standing. The island fell without much resistance, and Theophanes says the Arabs sold the Colossus to a Jewish trader in Edessa who carried it away on 900 camels. In fact, I think it's more likely that the statue had already collapsed some 800 years earlier in an earthquake in 226 BC and had lain in pieces since then. Indeed, I find it surprising any of it was still visible after such a length of time, but Theophanes' description shows the ancient world still lived on, if only in the imagination. Muawiyah was not just busy with his fleet. On land, the Byzantines suffered a serious blow when the Armenian governor Theodore defected to the Arabs, just as the fall of Egypt had been facilitated by religious division between the Monophysites and Chalcedonians. So it seems the defection of Armenia was caused by yet another religious quarrel. In 649, the Byzantine government had decreed the Armenian church should be subordinate to Constantinople and accept the Chalcedonian Creed. This prompted the Armenian church to break away from Constantinople at the Synod of Devin in the same year. For centuries thereafter, Constantinople would be at loggerheads with Armenia, undermining what should have been a natural alliance between the two Christian states against Islam. Such was the damage caused by internal Christian disputes. In 655, the Emperor Constans took the war to the Arabs, confident the Byzantine navy could defeat the fledgling Arab one, which was probably manned largely by Monophysite Christians from Egypt and Syria. He personally led it out from its harbours in Constantinople and around the Aegean to meet the Arabs off the Lycian coast, close to what is today Antalya in southern Turkey. We have only a very limited description of the battle from Theophanes, which merely says Muawiyah won a great victory, with the sea turning red with Byzantine blood. Theophanes gives us no reasons why Muawiyah won, but he tells us two anecdotes. One is that on the night before the battle, Constans dreamt he was in Thessalonica, and when he awoke and wanted to know the meaning of his dream, he was told by a man wise in interpreting dreams that this was a bad omen, since Thessaloniki in Greek sounds like Thes allo Nike, which also means in Greek, give victory to another. Theophanes also recounts that Constans was nearly killed in the bloody battle and only escaped because of the bravery of a soldier who put on the emperor's clothes and fought to the death, while Constans fled disguised as an ordinary soldier on a boat back to Constantinople. It looked as if the Byzantine state might go the way of the Sasanian, and very rapidly too. As the new Arab fleet sailed into the Aegean, it captured a series of islands on its way to the Byzantine capital, and simultaneously the Arab army in Syria advanced into Anatolia. The Byzantine units retreated. Muawiyah and his boss, the Caliph Uthman, must have thought they would go down in history as the ones who destroyed Byzantium, or Rome as they called it. But then disaster struck the Arab fleet. Our only source on the subject says a violent storm destroyed the Arab ships. Historians have never been sure whether this was just the invocation of divine saviour, so common in medieval records, or whether the Byzantine navy, which we know was filled with highly skilled Greek sailors from across the Aegean, had some part in it. Whatever the truth, Muawiyah's offensive came to a grinding halt. His navy, or what was left of it, retreated south, and the Arab forces in Anatolia backed off. Worse was to follow for the Arabs. The following year, in 565, Uthman was murdered by a mob. His rule had become unpopular because of his policy of appointing members of his own family to government positions of any importance. This had alienated powerful families which united against him before they too fell out. Ali ibn Abi Talib, who I will just call Ali, was proclaimed the fourth caliph, since he was related to Muhammad as his cousin and son-in-law. But his election was resisted by many senior Islamic governors, including Muhammad's third wife, Aisha, and most importantly by Uthman's trusted lieutenant, Muawiyah. From 557 until 561, a brutal civil war known as the First Fitna paralysed the Islamic Caliphate. Ali defeated some of his opponents, but was unable to defeat Muawiyah, whose powerful Syrian army dominated the Arab military machine. In 561, Ali was assassinated, and the Syrian general Muawiyah deposed his successor Hassan and proclaimed himself the first Umayyad caliph. The first fitna was hugely important in Islamic history for two reasons. First, it was the official beginning of the split between Sunni and Shia Islam. Shia, meaning followers or faction in Arabic, refers to the group of Muslims who believed Muhammad's descendants, starting with Ali, should have succeeded him instead of Abu Bakr and the subsequent caliphs who had no familial relationship with the Prophet. In contrast, Sunni, meaning tradition in Arabic, accepts the first four caliphs as the rightful successors to the Prophet. Shia Muslims were hostile to Muawiyah, who they held accountable for murdering Ali. Although the Shiites would not establish an independent power base for 1,000 years until the Persian Safavids established a rival to the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century, this marked the first big religious division within Islam and echoed the divisions within Christianity, showing just how important the split is to modern Islam. As I record this, Saudi Arabia has just released a film called Muawiyah, celebrating his life, which Shiite Iran has banned as blasphemous. The Emperor Constans must have celebrated his good luck. Up until the first fitna, the rise of Islam had seemed unstoppable. Byzantium had been on the cusp of annihilation, but suddenly civil war paralysed Islam, as one chronicler observed, quote, "The blood of the slaughter of immense multitudes flowed thickly among the armies of Ishmael," i.e. the Arab armies. Warfare afflicted them as they engaged in mutual carnage, end quote. He and the Byzantine people must have hoped at long last God was back on their side. They were certainly given a breathing space, and Constans seized it. An army was dispatched to Armenia, where the Armenian princes repudiated their alliance with Islam and made a formal submission to the emperor. Some historians think it was during these years that the Byzantine theme system was created in Anatolia. This was a military administration crucially important over the next 2 centuries, in which Anatolia was divided initially into 4 main themes or military provinces. Historians can't agree on exactly when, how and why this system operated, but it appears each theme contained the remnants of one of the old Roman field armies. For example, the theme of the Oriens was the site of the old army of the East. Armenia contained the field army of that region, originally created by Justinian. Rather confusingly, the theme of Thrace, or Thrakesion in Greek, contained the Thracian field army, which had been moved to Anatolia when the Balkans was virtually abandoned to the Slavs, and the Opsikion theme in Greek was the area around Constantinople containing the imperial guard units. Archaeological evidence for this period also shows a number of cities were converted into formidable fortresses, such as at Pergamum, Ephesus and Sardis. But it seems Constans had bigger ambitions than just survival. In a remarkable initiative, he sailed to Italy in 662, apparently hoping to eject the Lombards, but he couldn't even defeat the small and independent Lombard Duchy of Benevento in the south. Instead, he found consolation with an official visit to Rome in 663, the first by any emperor since the fall of the western half of the empire in the 5th century. And then he moved for 6 years to Syracuse in Sicily. Syracuse was a major port, and it seems he was building up the Byzantine navy there. Carthage and North Africa were still in Byzantine hands, and with Sicily, southern Italy, Greece and Anatolia, Byzantium still occupied a powerful position in the western and northern Mediterranean, and although no chroniclers have recorded his plans, most historians think he was preparing to invade Egypt. But the new Caliph Muawiyah was alert to this. He was restoring the Arab fleet. In this era, a navy wasn't created overnight. It took years to build ships and train oarsmen and sailors. In the meantime, the Arab land offensives continued. In 668, a huge Arab army captured the heavily fortified town of Armorium, deep in western Anatolia. Panic was building in Constantinople, and Constance's absence from the city sparked resentment. In 669, he was murdered in the baths at Syracuse, killed by his attendant with a soap dish, which he used to beat him over the head with. It's never been revealed whether this attendant, who was called Andrew and who fled the scene and disappeared from history, was paid by dissidents in Constantinople or by the army in Sicily, which promptly rebelled and set up their own emperor named Misizios, an Armenian soldier. The result was Constance's eldest son, the 18-year-old Constantine IV, was proclaimed emperor in Constantinople by the Senate. His reign would witness an extraordinary reversal of Byzantine fortunes, but there was little sign of that to begin with. Constantine's initial problem was Misios's revolt in Sicily, which he was worried would attract Muawiyah's attention. But Muawiyah had much bigger plans than taking Sicily. He was eyeing Constantinople again. Having failed to capture it when he was a mere general, now that he was caliph, surely it was his destiny to deliver Constantinople to Islam. Muawiyah began his campaign with cunning. Knowing that Constantine was worried about the rebellion in Sicily, he made it look as if Arab forces were intent on exploiting this weakness in Byzantine defences by sending a fleet to capture the island of Jerba off the northern African coastline, close to modern Tunisia, and close to both Carthage and Sicily. Falling for this, Constantine set sail from Constantinople in 670 with the main battle fleet. But the moment he did that, Muawiyah revealed his hand. the capture of Jerba was merely a diversion. A much larger Arab fleet, led by his admiral Fadala, sailed into the Aegean, heading straight for Constantinople. He landed at Cyzicus in the Sea of Marmara, less than 100 miles from the city. For over a year, the sea around Constantinople was blockaded by Arab warships. As evidence of this, we know from papal sources that the Patriarch's customary exchange of letters with the Pope in Rome was curtailed, since ships couldn't sail south down the Bosphorus because of the Arabs. However, at this point, historians debate what happened next, since the sources aren't entirely clear on the chronology. They all agree Muawiyah was tightening the noose around Constantinople. More and more Arab warships were entering the Aegean. Rhodes was occupied. An Arab army was landed in Cilicia in southwest modern Turkey. But at some point, the Byzantine fleet returned from Sicily, having put down the rebellion there, and it scored a spectacular victory over the Arab admiral Fadala. Historians believe this happened either in around 669 or later in around 673 to 674. More important than the timing is why the Byzantines could win this victory, having been miserably defeated at the Battle of the Masts in 655. And on this point, everyone is in agreement. They used a technological innovation that would transform naval warfare. It was called Greek fire. The secret of Greek fire was that it could burn on water, making it impossible to put out in a naval battle. We don't know what it was exactly, but it was presumably some sort of petrol compound. Not only was the liquid itself highly destructive, but the Byzantines had designed a form of medieval flamethrower. Again, we don't know quite how it operated, but it could spurt the Greek fire some distance at enemy ships. As such, it was lethal, and it was obviously difficult to copy, since none of the empire's opponents ever developed it. Theophanes says it was invented by, quote, Kallinikos, a skilled mechanic from Heliopolis who fled to the Romans. He'd devised a sea fire which ignited the Arab ships and burned them with all hands. Thus it was that the Romans achieved victory, end quote. He says Constantine had masterminded the preparations to use Greek fire. Quote, when Constantine learned of the movement of God's enemies against Constantinople, he prepared huge two-storied warships equipped with Greek fire and siphon-carrying warships, ordering them to anchor in the Proclionatian harbour of the Caesareum, which was a small harbour in Constantinople. End quote. The use of Greek fire was a turning point in Byzantium's fight for survival. Muawiyah's badly burnt fleet fled south. According to our sources, a violent storm did even more damage to it. Shortly afterwards, in around 678, another disaster struck Muawiyah's empire. There was a Christian uprising against the Arabs in Syria, led by so-called Mardites. Exactly who they were has always been unclear, but they seem to have been a collection of Levantine Christians, joined, according to Theophanes, by slaves and prisoners, suggesting they represented an underclass dissatisfied with their lot under the Arab rulers. They remind me a little bit of the so-called Bagodai, the rebellious Gallic peasantry in the Western Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, who were also joined by runaway slaves. Constantine helped them by sending supplies to them by ship, suggesting the Byzantines had recovered naval control of the eastern Mediterranean. Amazingly, Muawiyah was sufficiently worried to ask for peace. He even agreed to pay tribute to Byzantium. It wasn't a large tribute. Every year it was 3,000 gold coins, or solidi, 50 freed prisoners of war, and 50 of the finest Arab horses. But this marked an almost unbelievable turnaround from the position just a few years earlier, when Byzantium had seemed to be on the point of extinction. So what caused this Arab collapse, apart from their losses to Greek fire? The answer seems to be that Muawiyah was losing his touch. He was a very old man by the standards of the time, around 80 years old, and died shortly in 680, and he couldn't control rising discontent with his rule. Immediately on his death, civil war broke out again. The so-called second fitna, as the civil war is called, was even more brutal than the first. Ali's supporters rose up against Muawiyah's son Yazid, who Muawiyah had nominated to succeed him. In the city of Constantinople, there were wild celebrations, although its population had probably fallen to a fraction of its Justinianic size, maybe 40,000 or so compared with well over 500,000. They felt God had returned to their side. Theophanes says that the rulers of the West were so impressed with Constantine's triumph over Islam that, quote, the Avar Khagan, the kings, rulers and governors of the West, sent envoys with gifts to the emperor, asking for confirmation of his peaceful alliance with them, end quote. Byzantium had triumphed. It was indeed a lucky escape. It seems to have been due to the invention of Greek fire, Islamic civil wars, plus a few well-timed storms at sea. But luck seldom lasts. The Arabs would soon be back, and this time their fleets and armies would be even larger. The greatest test still lay ahead. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll continue in a week's time on the 5th of April. And if you like the podcast, why not leave a review, tell a friend, or best of all, sign up to my newsletter where you can get a free ebook. Just visit my website, nickholmesauthor.com, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.